In A2.7, IB wants you to understand how they figured out what part of the brain does what. And there are three major areas. They did uh, research using animals as part of their experiments. Also, autopsies. Lesions. Lesions are simply injuries. And the last one, I guess that's four. And the last one is something called a functional magnetic resonance image. And these four things provided scientists insights about what part of the brain has what function. So let's look at animal experiments first. There's not much here to say except about the ethical issues. Quite simply, they just can rewire animal brains. They can remove parts of the animal brain. They can take the cranium off the top and poke it to see what things happen to it. So there's definitely ethical issues associated with this. And a lot of people don't think it's the right way to do research. But back in the day, that was probably the only way to really find out what part of the brain does what. The other issue is that the animals that have the closest similarities to us as far as brains are primates. And again, people have a lot of ethical issues with that. The second one is autopsies, and probably the most famous one was when they finally discovered what part of the brain is responsible for speech. So this is called the Broca area. So the Broca region of the brain is now known as the area where language is processed. But they didn't know. So back in the day, in 1861, there was a French doctor, and his name was Broca, and he had a 21-year-old student who lost his speech. And he was curious if it was like associated with a certain part of the brain. And after that person passed away, he performed an autopsy, and he identified that there was damage done to that part of the brain. So he hypothesized that that is where that area for speech and language is associated. Third are lesions. Again, there's probably many stories, but the most famous one is this guy named Phineas, who had a railroad stake fly up through his chin, through the back of his eye, and then out through the top of his skull, and he survived it. However, he was much different. So he lacked some basic social skills. He was always like a well-respected person, but he lost a lot of those social processes about how to behave in public. And later on, when they did an autopsy on his brain, they figured out that the frontal area of his brain was severely damaged, and that's where we do a lot of our processing. And the last one, thank goodness technology has come a long way, is something called fMRIs. So fMRIs is just a technique where we can use magnetic resonance technology to determine what part of the brain is using oxygen. So if the brain is firing, if those neurons are carrying signals, if you remember, those sodium-potassium pumps have to be moving and redistributing the sodiums and potassiums in the right place, and that takes a lot of energy, which requires cell respiration, which requires oxygen. So actually, hemoglobin has two different states. So it is in a form where it has oxygen, and then when it loses it, it's in a different form. So they're either known as oxyhemoglobin or deoxyhemoglobin. And those two types of hemoglobin respond differently to magnetic fields. And those differences in the magnetic fields can be represented in different colors. So when we look at these images, and you're going to see an interesting video after this, when you look at these images, you can see what part of the brains are firing, what part of the brains are losing lots of oxygen, or I shouldn't say the brain are losing, but the red blood cells are losing oxygen, which means that the brain is using it. for cell respiration, and you can see those different colors to identify what part of the brain does what.